Well, a couple of days ago, we had set out to try to say something about the two truths as they are expressed in different tenet systems. And although I've spent a lot of time since yesterday thinking about all the other things we've been talking about, and I still have more to say about that, none of which will be new to you, but it's like, I guess, practice to go over these things together and think about them. But I still think we should go ahead and start by talking about the tenets, and when we'll find a way to come back around, either in the course of the hour or later, to the question of what it means for things to be merely imputations by thought. Our teacher, the Buddha, didn't write a book called My System by Shakyamuni. And this is, cultural happenstance. But it didn't work out that way. And instead, he talked with people, and then sometimes he talked to people. But sometimes he talked with people. Answered questions and challenged things, and he did that for a long time, and a lot of different kinds of people, lots of different audiences, and sometimes these are very short conversations, and sometimes they went on for a long time. But that's really different from writing a book, right? Where you say, well, okay, I'm now going to explain all my ideas in like an organized way. It's like what you do each day, I guess you would say, what can I say that will be helpful to these people here now? And so that's very useful for those people, but for it to be of help for us later, we have to figure out how to organize what all these different teachings were and how they fit together. And it's not just for us. I mean, this is a problem from early on in Buddhism. People looking back and saying, well, when we have a question, we can't just go ask the teacher. We have all these different things that are, have been passed down that he said on different days to different audiences, but then someone has to figure out how it all fits together and organize it, right? Indian Buddhists did that in lots of different ways. There wasn't just one way to say, put together what was important and which categories or frameworks that Buddha had taught in different ways, in different days, and different times should be superseded and put within the context of a broader meaning provided by the others. And so there are obviously many different views that developed within Indian Buddhism about what the Buddha taught. Even setting aside the question of people not always agreeing upon which things were actually sutras, even setting that to the side, the tradition is that there were 18 different non-Mahayana tenet systems, and maybe it's a good thing, I don't know, but maybe a bad, I don't know, but they're not all preserved. I mean, we don't know really what all the different ones say. For some of them, we just know a name. We know some of them by way of their being refuted in other texts. So there would be people called that who said this, but we don't. But for other ones, we know, quite a bit about these different views. And just as the Indian Buddhists had this problem looking back on what the Buddhists taught, then there was so many proliferations of different ways that the Indian Buddhists had tried to make sense out of this. Then all of this came to Tibet. It's all the sutras, and then all the different ways that all these different Indian thinkers in all these different centuries had tried to sort that out and put that together in different systems, which partially agreed with each other and partially disagreed with each other on every conceivable point, frankly, pretty much. Is there a real person, for example? You would think that would have been clear, but no. There were some who said there was. And so there wasn't, there was so many different points of view. And in Tibet, there developed this schema, and this is not just true of Tibet. It happened in China and other places that Buddhism went. People said, well, let's find a way to organize this so that we can explain it and teach the history of Buddhist philosophy and how to think about all the different kinds of things people have said that Buddha said in some sort of structured way. And this is what's taught as trumta, or tenets, in Tibet. It's not as though people in India were saying, oh, Buddha taught these 4 tenet systems, and which one will I join, or which sub-school, and if you're going to go to the Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamaka sub-school, then you want to go to this monastery, because everybody, that's what we mean by school, it's the school where they teach that. No, it wasn't anything like that. There were all different thinkers and different writers, and sometimes they coalesced, and sometimes within these temporary coalescings there were still disagreements, but because everybody had their own ideas. And so the whole, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the schema of 4 tenet systems is a device. It's artificial, and it's extremely helpful. I'm all in favor of it, but you have to realize it's not just a matter of that. In other words, it's a construction from a Tibetan framework for trying to make sense out of the tangle of all these different Indian philosophical systems. And so sometimes people have, as I explained in near the introduction part of Appearance and Reality, people, well, by people I mean Western scholars that I go to conferences with, are quite negative about this literature, tenets. They have no respect for it whatsoever, because it's not, in their view, historical, and it's highly synthetic. It's a confabulation in their view, and doesn't represent anything like. This is a distorted view, I think, as I'm saying, but it doesn't represent anything on the ground in India, but it's like a story that Tibetans have made up about what was happening in India. Now, I think this is like going in an extreme. I'm trying to say, look, don't take this as an absolute picture of exactly what was in India. On the other hand, to say it's worthless because it's just a made-up story and we shouldn't bother with it is like going too far. But this is the way I've understood it, is that, like, why do people want to go to the trouble of reading Dharmakirti or Tsongkhapa or Vasubandhu? These are very hard books. And then trying to figure out the history of how these ideas related to each other in India is even harder, in part because the Indians weren't interested in history. They didn't keep close tabs on which things happened historically in relationship to what other things. So it's just a mess in trying to figure out, well, if we want to really do a intellectual history of Buddhist philosophy in India that's chronological and is grounded in these texts, it's a very, very difficult, detailed work, which hasn't yet been done by what the Western scholars who are criticizing the Trungpa literature either themselves, but they're trying to do it. Okay, so that's, it's not as though they're just criticizing and not doing it. They're trying to do that, and people make progress. You can see John Dunn's book on Dharmakirti represents something different than what was available when I was in grad school, for example. But my feeling was, starting out in this, that, and I think other people are like this, is why do you want to go to all that trouble unless you have some idea what the idea, that's a lot of work, unless we have some idea what the ideas are, a framework for thinking about, well, what kind of ideas are in there, we might not be so interested in engaging in that kind of detailed study. And still, then even when you do engage in the detailed study, you have to have some sort of framework or schema to present them in. I have been, as I mentioned in this book, I've been at conferences where people will present as though it were some profound discovery of theirs, something that Jamyang Sheba had written a long time ago in his, great exposition of the tenet, which had been published in Jeffrey's Meditation on Emptiness book when he did his dissertation. But it's like, well, that was a Dharma book from Wisdom Publications. People didn't really read it or something, and so it wasn't taken as authoritative scholarship or something. And so it had to be somebody later who was, not looking at the tenets literature, but relying on looking at the original texts themselves and saying, do they say this? Not even referencing what Jamyang Sheba had said about what they said, or Jangya or anybody like that. So anyway, it's worth it's tenets. So tenets, even within the Tibetan tradition, right, is saying, okay, we have this marvelous way of thinking about what all these different Indian philosophies are, and it helps us get a picture in our mind of the diversity of Buddhist thinking. It's not supposed to be a substitute for then reading Nagarjuna or Chandrakirti or dare I say Dharmakirti, right? It's not supposed to be a substitute for that. It's supposed to be like, okay, now I know what's out there, and if I want to learn, go back to the primary sources and see what it really says, then, I can see what might be an interesting place for me to start, or my mind might be drawn in. So it's not supposed to be, and this is the same thing with, Yikcha, the texts that are used in the Tibetan monastic curriculum. A lot of people will just read what's in their monastic textbook, and it being very clear to them and written for them in a way that they can use to debate, and then they feel that they've learned these ideas. Most people then don't feel maybe any need or inclination to go back and say, because of course our teachers, had this right, it would almost be impious for me to presume to go back and read the original texts and think about them on my own, because, gosh, Jamyang Sheba did it, Panchen Sonam Trungpa did it, Jetsun Chögyal Gyaltsen did it for Sarah. So why would I think that I would know better than him, what Chandrakirti meant? And then that becomes kind of an excuse to not mix your mind with the original work. So that's the pros and cons of Trungpa as I am perceiving it at the present. And of course, that our tenet system literature is a huge literature, right? And it's there's all different kinds of tenets books. Some are very short, synoptic, quick handbooks, and then there's at the other end of the spectrum you have Jamyang Sheba's work, which is a kind of massive compendium of Indian philosophy, and his whole section on non-Buddhist systems is incredibly elaborate, going through everything that was known in Tibet about all the different non-Buddhist Indian systems of thought. Okay. Okay, so that's sort of a general comment about that. Then, what's said within the tradition then is that there are these four views. And this is on page 11 in Appearance and Reality, right? And you guys already know it. 2 Mahayana tenet systems, the Madhyamaka or middle way system, and the mind-only or Chittamatra system, and 2 lesser vehicle, Hinayana tenet systems, the Sautranika or Sutra school, and the Great Exposition or Vaibhashika school. So, that was just 4, there's 4. and of course, that you can see that was just intending to comprehend Indian philosophy, but that was the idea, is that any kind of real legitimate Buddhist philosophical view should either be some variation of some subdivision of one of those 4. That's the idea. So you have and then what these 4 have in common, this list too, is that they disagree about everything, as far as like what exists, what practices people should do, and what the nature of enlightenment is. But they have in common the 4 seals, which is that all products are impermanent, all contaminated things are miserable, suffering, all phenomena are selfless, and nirvana is peace. Right? So that's interesting. I was trying to remember where, I don't know if you know, like where does the list of 4 seals come from? I saw this recently, but anyway, it's something very, I think the source for the list of these 4 seals is quite late. It's not like, but obviously the ideas that it refers to, that it identifies are, it's quite a good list that identifies, what is common among different Buddhist outlooks, and is widely accepted, this list, in Tibetan way of thinking about different Buddhist philosophical systems. Have you guys seen the book, What Makes You Not a Buddhist? That's like a hot seller right now. You haven't seen it? Tensei Norbu? What Makes You Not a Buddhist? It's like, it's a beginner's book, right? What makes you not a Buddhist? Well, it's organized around the 4 seals. As to what makes, if you say you're a Buddhist, but do you really think that all products are impermanent and so forth? And it goes, that's how the book's set up around the 4 seals. It's very easy to read and a nice book. My thought about it, since I'm just, I guess it's the nature of academics to want to quibble with things, is like, okay, so I guess that most of the Buddhist world is now out, right? Because like like when you go and live among Tibetans for a while, and you find out that most of them don't know the first thing about Buddhist philosophy, right? They know how to say "Om Mani Padme Hum," right? But they don't like. Okay, what do you mean by non-affirming negative or something like that? Not going to get too far. So, and it's not just that with Tibetans, right? Of course, it's that way everywhere. People have a great deal of faith in the 3 jewels, who are not philosophically inclined. They're sort of counting on the bhikkhus and bhikshunis and other people who have chosen to devote themselves to that kind of specialized activity, to know this kind of stuff for them and to put it into action in their practice. And that then typical Buddhist practice is to try to improve one's mind by getting restraining bad actions, and by dana, by being generous to other people, these other people being experts who are presumed to be actually understanding what the philosophy is. I mean, that's what it really is in the world, I think. So I would say that people take refuge in the 3. This is me. People take refuge in the 3 jewels from the depths of their heart. I'm going to count that person as a Buddhist, whether they understand the 4 seals or not, because that taking refuge is what is the idea. Now, you may not actually understand the objects of refuge, and this is what His Holiness was on about a great deal, at Lehigh, is like in order to understand each of these 3 objects of refuge, in a Buddhist way, you have to understand emptiness, you have to understand Buddhist philosophy. And so there is this whole idea that, well, people have taken refuge, but have they really taken refuge? And what does refuge really mean then becomes another much deeper thing that cannot help but engage this philosophy or be grounded in it. I'm not sure how to think about that. I've thought of the idea of but it reminds me a little bit of how the idea that everybody thinks that there's a billion Christians, but if you ask the Christian minister, they'll say, well, most of these people just come to church, but they don't have really very much faith. They don't have very strong idea. They don't know anything about the history. They don't know who Jesus was. They don't know what people have said about Jesus and how Jesus relates to God, at all, except whatever I tell them on Sunday. So their idea of is that our whole job is to get these people who are nominally Christians to convert to Christianity. That is, they have a concept of internal conversion. That is, being Christian, let's now figure out how to really be Christian. And that seems to me like the situation. And it's analogous to the situation in Buddhism, right? But anyway, I think it's not good to deprecate the faith of people who haven't engaged in philosophical study. I'm not saying that's what Kensei Nobu meant to do. It's a very catchy title, right? And it does get people starting at the beginning to think about this philosophy. Right? Anyway, so that's the idea of that there should be a common among these tenets, these four views, and then then there's the question of like who holds them in Tibet, or like how, given that if this is what the Tibetans are thinking, that those are the four views, then what are who actually holds those views among Tibetans? And you have one of my teachers, the one I was quoting the other day, Kensei Yeshituten, he said, well, in all the different, and he mentioned four. He didn't mention Jonam, but he said among the four orders of Tibetan Buddhism, there are advocates of all four tenet systems. So he was going to posit that, just because you're a Gelugpa didn't mean that you couldn't be a Vaibhashika. And he was going to say, there are Gelugpa Vaibhashikas, there are Gelugpa Sautranikas, there are Gelugpa Chittamatras, and so forth. And he was going to say, and same with all the other tenet systems, and you shouldn't think that these are the same thing at all. That being a member of a certain Churluk, Dharma system in Tibet doesn't necessarily determine your philosophical view, because it's something that you're working out in your own mind. What view of selflessness or emptiness can I adopt and mix my mind with, while at the same time maintaining confidence that what I do makes a difference and actions have effects? And having great respect, of course, in Tsongkhapa, knowing that Tsongkhapa says we should follow Chandrakiri, it's possible that I could still find that for me right now, that might not be the most helpful way to think. I think I told Venerable Sturgeon this before, but I did meet a Tibetan, a Gelugpa, who told me that he was a Svatantrika, but he wanted me to keep it quiet. Yeah. He's telling me because I'm a Westerner, and I'm not going to he said, don't tell my teacher, Thought he would get in trouble. But anyway, I think that you have to separate those things, because just because the founder of a certain, it's true that everybody has great reverence for the teachers and they want to follow and embody what their teacher said, but it's about reason and using reason and thinking these things through yourself and figuring out where your mind can get to, and it's not just mimicking. Okay, well, prasanga, I have to be a prasangika because that's what Chandrakiri and Tsongkhapa said was the best one, and then that's kind of I think that's not supposed to be the attitude, or I don't think it's helpful. I think people have to think it through themselves and see what works for them at a certain point in time, and then maybe they change and evolve. But there's another attitude which I haven't encountered myself, but I think people could have, and that is a sense of humility, like that I'm very low, stupid person compared to Tsongkhapa, so I will take the bottom wrong, and I will stay with Vaibhashika view until and of course there is this other idea, is that whichever view you feel inclined toward, sympathetic to, that doesn't technically make you a Sautranika. If you have that, if you're sympathetic to the way the Sautranikas look at it, it doesn't really necessarily count you as a Sautranika, because the idea of tenets, Trumta or Siddhanta in Sanskrit, Trumta in Tibetan, is that these are established conclusions that you've reached. In other words, you have a firm or definitive understanding of the view that's taught in that system. Siddhanta. Coming to the end of making determinations or establishing things. Yeah. Do they speak of four Siddhantas?
Yeah, well, I'm wondering if it's
yeah, Trumta is Siddhanta. 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 Yeah. Yeah. You can see Drup is Siddha, right? And Ta is end, or end. Anta. Yeah, so it's coming to the end of the making conclusions. So the idea is that you've reached a firm conclusion, or a sort of. So the usual explanation I've heard is that to really be a Sautronica, you should have realized emptiness as it's taught in a Sautronica school. So well, because that's what they say, right? Because then you really have definitive knowledge of the. Anyway, that's the tradition. So then, as I mentioned, these four tenet systems are traditionally divided into the Mahayana ones and the Hinayana ones, and of course that's a very complicated, and it is really a confusing thing. First of all, what the tradition says about this is you have to be really careful to distinguish between having a Mahayana view and being Mahayana by path. That's like, without saying anything outside the tradition, this is what the tradition says. Because it makes a big difference. You can have a bodhisattva, a person, who's generated bodhicitta, but could have a vaibhashika view. Why, you could, right? It's like they don't have to have realized the profound emptiness in order to initially become a bodhisattva. And it may be that they're you could say, looking at it from the Tsongkhapa point of view, you could say, well, they're just a little farther along on the development of faith and compassion than they are in terms of their development of profound wisdom. And then in that would be the way of saying, of course, you could have a person who by path is Mahayana, but by view is holding one of the non-Mahayana philosophical systems, right? So they're two completely different things. Their usually way of saying is if you're generating the bodhicitta's altruistic intention to become enlightened for the sake of all beings, that's what they mean as being Mahayana by path. Whereas if you're adopting the Mahayana or Chittamatra philosophical system, then that's what it means to be Mahayana by view. And it's not the same thing, right? So this is what the tradition itself says, that you have to be careful to distinguish those things. So that allows room for the conversation like Venerable Chodron was bringing up the other day about like Theravada bodhisattvas and the idea of having realization of emptiness within non-Mahayana systems and so forth. There's not like this kind of very clear absolute difference between these two. It's certainly true if you think about non-Mahayana systems. If you have a non-Mahayana system, you still have to have a bodhisattva path, because where the future, in their understanding, right, Buddha passes away, but then and Buddhism dies out, but then there has to be some time that Buddhism comes back again in the future, and that will happen only because there's like a person who's a bodhisattva right now who's practicing to become a Buddha in the future. So there has to be like a bodhisattva path in Theravada, and I didn't hear, it's like they have the word and the concept of bodhisattva, but normally they don't talk about the bodhisattva path, but sometimes they do. And that's, it's in some way indispensable to any Buddhist system to have a way that somebody could become a Buddha in the future. Whatever you think a Buddha is, right? There has to be a next one. And really, I think the difference is, the way I teach my students in university is not the difference is whether they're bodhisattvas or not. Not the difference of whether some people aspire to become enlightened as Buddhas or not. The difference is whether you make bodhisattva, whether you say every one of us has the potential to become a perfectly enlightened Buddha, and therefore it's the ideal that every one of us needs to aspire to enter the bodhisattva path. That's really not present in Theravada Buddhism. We have an arhat ideal. Most people, it's exceptional to find these texts where there's describing the bodhisattva practice outside of Mahayana. Whereas in Mahayana, it would be extraordinary to find something saying, well, if you're not feeling up to the bodhisattva path, here's another little thing for you so you can go into your nirvana cave. I mean, they wouldn't say like that. And so, but still they do believe it's possible, right? And they do believe that non-Mahayanists can realize the profound, have the correct view, right? You can have somebody who's not generating compassion, that realizes the profound emptiness, escapes from cyclic existence. Right? So you can have the view without the aspiration. You can have the aspiration without the view. And so it's not like an absolute kind of divide between the two. It's more emphasis for kind of what you take as the ideal of what we should all do, or what is all of our potential, I guess. Okay. I talked about that. So, yeah, let's talk a little bit about the particular of the Vaibhashika system. So, I mentioned this problem of like after the time of the Buddha, Buddha not having written his book, his big book, laying it all out for us, and people are like, well, we're going to have to sort it out, and then you have these texts appear called the Abhidhammas, right? And there's these treatises that are written, right, in the, say, 3rd century BCE, roughly, and in which people are trying to, there's 7 main ones, and Theravadins say, what?
Well, the Sravastivada and the Theravada 7 are different.
Right, okay. Since our Sravastivadin have a 7 and Theravada have a different 7, the Theravadins say that the Abhidhamma texts are the word of the Buddha. Not all Theravadins. Some Theravadins say that this is... that's what I've heard. It's like, I always say 3 baskets.
Yeah. Well, some say the Buddha spoke to Sravasti and then Sita wrote it down. Others say that that's the Arhat.
Mm.
And then still others, more modern speakers, have said that it's,
written, composed.
Yeah, other people after the time of the Buddha who put it together.
Which seems to be more like what other people say who aren't in Theravada.
Yeah.
But then, but traditionally the idea, right, was that in Theravada you have 3 baskets, and the 3rd basket was this collection of texts, which appear to be attempts to systematize what the Buddha taught in all his discourses, rather than actual discourses by the Buddha. And so, as Venerable Chodron was explaining, some people feeling very strongly that this had to be the word of Buddha might understand that as being something that Buddha was saying, right? But the usual, understanding outside that kind of traditional Theravada perspective is that someone or some group of persons, right, being aware of this difficulty of sorting out all these so many sutras and trying to organize what they all said, created texts which did this kind of systematizing work. Okay, that's the idea. So then a text called the Mahavibhasha appeared, which attempted to comment upon and be like a commentary or critique of the ideas in these different Abhidhamma texts. And this, synthesizing all the different things that the Abhidhamma texts had and sort of commenting on them. And what we call the Vaibhashika school is purported to be the view of this Mahavibhasha. That's why it's called Vaibhashika, because it corresponds to this Mahavibhasha commentary on the Abhidhamma. But, yes, the correction, yes.
No, I was just wondering, because I think some people say that the Sravastivada was the main school, and the Vaibhashikas were like a breakout group. Which started their own. Is that the common view that I could...
Well, what I've been reading is on this is Paul Williams' book, Buddhist Thought, and his interpretation is, okay, she's introduced the word Sarvastivadins. His interpretation is that the Sarvastivadin was an early name for the people who came subsequently to be called more formally the Vaibhashikas. And he frequently calls them the Sarvastivadins, but by Sravastivadins, he means the same people who come to be called later the Vaibhashikas. So it may be that there were some people who were called Sravastivadins, and then once the Mahavibhasha emanating from their camp came to appear, then people came to know them by the name in relationship to that text.
Or maybe they were split up.
There could be some Sravastivadins who didn't agree with the Mahavibhasha, right? And then you have yet another group, right? Yeah, well, that's the way I understand it, and this isn't like something I've spent a lot of time on, but I think that the Sarvastivadins were as best we can understand it, the Sarvastivadins were the base group from which what we're calling the Mahavibhasha and then the Vaibhashika position arises. But a complication in this is that the Tibetans are all saying, oh, well, this is what the Vaibhashika is saying, it's based on the Mahavibhasha. They didn't have the Mahavibhasha in Tibetan. They didn't actually know what it said. And even today, it's not, I gather, it's only partially translated into Tibetan. And so everything that's said in the tenets literature, which has been around for centuries now, it doesn't really, it says, well, this is what we understand to be the view of the Vaibhashikas based on the Mahavibhasha, but it's actually based on the root text of Vasubandhu's Abhidharma Kosha, the verses of Abhidharma Kosha, not the commentary, which are taken as representing the same or similar view, right? Whether they really do or not. But so anyway, let's just say that what Tibetans take and present traditionally in this tenet system as the Vaibhashika view is based actually on Vasubandhu and not on the text that it's supposed to be connected to directly. It may be though that there's some there is some close overlap. It's just not the fact that you can't say these are the same thing. Okay, so anyway, what does that all being the case, what do they actually say about the two truths in this Vaibhashika? Maybe I should say one more thing because you brought up Sarvastivadin. Sarvastivadin, do you know what that word means? Yeah. Sarvastivadins, the ones who hold the Vadins, the ones who advocate the view that everything exists. And what this meant, one of the things this meant, was that all the dharmas of the past, present, and future exist. It's not just like the present exists, like everything of the past, present, and future exists. And then how do you tell the difference between, you know what I'm about to say, how do you tell the difference between the present ones that are operational and the past ones, which also exist, right? If you think, well, that's so weird, then you can think about our conversation about Martin Luther King, why people would... This has actually had this argument in Western philosophy, too, about whether we can talk about, Abraham Lincoln as existing or not, and so forth. And the people who say, no, only what exists in the exact present can be spoken of as existing, those people are actually in the minority in Western philosophy. Because it becomes so difficult, you can't say anything, right? Because it's already gone before you... So anyway, so the Sarvastivadins solve that problem by saying, well, all the past and present and future dharmas exist, but there's something different about the ones that are present, and that is that they have their own nature. They have their own nature. They have svabhava. They have, in Sanskrit, the thing that comes to be used as the word for the object of negation later on. They have some intrinsic property of being right now that the other ones in the past and the future don't have. Okay, anyway, so that's the Vaibhashikas emerge out of that context, and they're associated with this idea that, yeah, things truly exist. You could call them realists in a sense. We sometimes use that way of talking. But they don't all, these things that exist, or you could say truly exist, they don't all exist, they don't all get their entity, they don't all get their nature in the same way. Some things get their essence, their true nature, by virtue of being irreducible substances, which can't be, you just can't get down any farther. And other things, well, conventional truths, get their nature because they're what we call a whole collection of these irreducible substances. That's basically the idea in shorthand, okay? So, we have a very strong sense of what the wholeness and integrity of ourselves, of our bodies, of all kinds of things. It's like something we're always trying to protect. It's so strong, it's not something that's part of one particular culture or one particular personality type. It's pervasive, right? That people want to have a sense of where I end and everything else begins, and that's a very important boundary. And there's a sense of wholeness and integrity that I want to maintain all my parts together as mine on this side. And then anthropologists have argued this is why there's so much concern, about pollution taboos. It's not because people are afraid of bacteria that they regard feces and blood and spit and mucus as contaminating. It was because these things were transgressive, like fingernail clippings, of the boundaries between what's the person and what's not the person. And it's like you're taking the body apart into little pieces. This automatically, these was part of my body a minute ago, but now it's not part of my body. Hair clippings, just about everything. When you look at this cross-culturally, pretty much the only thing that's part of the body and then comes off or away from it that isn't almost universally considered taboo and gross is tears. But except for tears, which some have are often put in some sort of special category, everything else is just thought of as it makes people uncomfortable and disrupts our sense of wholeness. And of course, what Buddhist meditations have always done is say, yeah, but this sense of wholeness and integrity, that you're some real person that exists and is completely temporary and artificial. And if you don't, you see that object of desire and think that person has some intrinsic wholeness and desirability that's radiating from that side. But check out the charnel grounds, and you can watch the process. And the people actually, it's a little bit more difficult to do right now, right? But they actually, they had their bodies there, and they could go and see, well, these are the parts of the body, and this is how they come apart, and this is the different kinds of fluids that are there, and the different kinds of substances, and what we call a person is just this kind of collection that's imputed to the body, and then this stream of consciousness that's temporarily associated with that particular stream of matter. So I think this is a very important idea here, that these people, the Vaibhashikas, were saying we're trapped in cyclic existence because we're attached to a self which we're imputing to this collection of parts. But when we search among the parts, we don't find any such self that's graspable as what we're believing in. Instead, we find when we break things down, only these aggregates and as irreducible things. So they had this. This is the key, the definitions of the two truths. You probably heard them before, but from Vasubandhu, if the awareness of something does not operate after that thing is destroyed or mentally separated into other parts, then that thing just exists conventionally. Before I give you the examples, I'll read the definite. Ultimate truth is a phenomenon which is such that if it were physically destroyed or mentally separated into parts, the consciousness apprehending it would not be canceled. So basically you have the reducible and the irreducible. There's something, that they use the word in Sanskrit, dravya sat. That's what we translate into English, or it's zayir in Tibetan, substantially existent, we usually say. Something, or in Western philosophy they call it primary. Something that like is fundamental, irreducible, first order, can't be broken down any further, not made up by the mind. It's what we're looking for when we have these conversations, something that you can really get down to and build everything out. It's true, it's like it's true, the person's built up out of this stuff, but okay, so there's that stuff, bile is part of that. Bile must be real. Well, no, bile, we could break that down further, but yeah, when you break it down far enough, there must be something that we can really, is the foundation bit, out of which we can build, depending on how we put it together, bile or blood or bone or pus or whatever you need, to make the person. Right? Yeah. So that's what they believed in. They call these, talk about these things as particles sometimes, irreducible particles. They have two kinds of particles. The directionally partless particles. Directionally partless particles are like infinitely tiny bits of matter, and they have to be directionally partless, because if they had a north, a south, a east, or a west, then they would have parts. So that's what it means to say they're directionally partless. You're having a hard time thinking of a point that's also a matter, but that's their idea, as like directionally partless particle. And then there's like different kinds of directionally partless particles. You can't like physically break up a directionally partless particle, but the directionally partless particles are of different sorts, and they're made out of what's called substance particles. And these substance particles can be co-located in different combinations to make up different kinds of directionally partless particles. So directionally partless, but I know it's like, I know. Well, but this is what they say. So, like, how can you have these co-located substance particles? Because these substance particles lack the quality of resistance that keeps two things from being in the same place at the same time. But, on the other hand, when you put together 6 to 11 of these substance particles, depending on the situation, put them together, when they're co-located to constitute a directionally partless particle, then these directionally partless particles do have resistance. That is, they're not able to have, you cannot have two directionally partless particles that are in the same place. That's how you can build stuff, because each of these directionally partless particles has resistance. It can't be like put in the same place with the other one. Okay, so you can think about like, so, all right, well, this isn't our way of thinking about fundamentally what stuff is made out of. But if you're thinking about like, well, we have this problem, it's like, well, what is, we have to have an object of imputation for our thought table. What's the table made out of? And then you go down farther and farther, then you're thinking, well, they don't have tunneling microscopes or anything like that, so they're thinking like, what are the irreducible components of table? And really, my sense is that this is done in terms of meditative experience. I mean, that's the kind of microscope they had, was vipassana meditation, to see like what's the finest elements of this that we can notice or observe. What can we really see as being there? So, water is considered. Okay, so there are examples of conventional truth. Conventional truth is something that when it's physically smashed or mentally broken up, the mind that observes it is canceled. So obviously a pot isn't, this is an example, a pot or teacup is an example because, you drop it on the floor and then the mind that says cup just like goes. Right? So that's pretty easy to understand, these kinds of things. Then they say water is also water, or because water can be in all different shapes, and we can spread it out and so forth like that, and we'll still say water. But on the other hand, their understanding was that you could mentally separate water into different components: the taste of water, the smell of water, the feel of water, and so forth, and that water could be reduced into these further irreducible elements by mental analysis, not by physical distortion. So they have this idea that conventional truths are of two types: ones that are shapes, would get their basis imputation from being a shape, like a cup, a pot, a book, and so forth. And then when you smash that shape physically, then cancel the mind that apprehends it. That makes it a conventional truth. It only conventionally exists. On the other hand, there are other kinds of conventional truths which, you think like a mass of water that can be divided and changed into different shapes and spread out and so forth, and the mind doesn't disappear. But you can mentally, and this is an important concept, I think, actually. There's several important concepts that, in other aspects of Buddhist philosophy. It's not just a matter of being able to physically break things up. Can you analyze in the imagination, tearing something apart into smaller components and say, well, look, even if I can't actually take a quark or a string or a point instant of the smallest noticeable instant of my experience of anger, and if there's no way then I can physically divide it or notice something smaller than what's in it, I can still understand conceptually that moment of anger has to have a beginning, middle, and an end, and I can mentally divide it up into parts, or I can mentally analyze what are the different components that are there without thinking of it as something as irreducible. And so that's what they're doing. They have this idea that things can be mentally broken up or things can be physically broken up, but either way you do it, there's going to be some things that can't be broken up, right? And they take as examples of things that can't be broken up, or that the mind apprehending it is not canceled. Both the directionally partless particles, the substance particles, temporally partless moments of consciousness, which are just like, I've just been doing matter, but it's the same thing with consciousness. You have just like you have directionally partless particles of matter, you have temporally partless moments of consciousness, right? In the same way, there's not a beginning and an end. And then uncompounded space, which means like the space that pervades everything, whether there's matter here or not. And also nirvana would be examples of things that are irreducible. This is so confusing. It's absolutely right. When they give the example, Vasubandhu gives the example of water as a conventional truth. He's not talking about the substance particle, right? But what are the substance particles? Okay, this is on page 20 in Appearance Reality. Within the desire realm, each of these, I'm calling them here conglomerate particles, that means these directionally partless particles that are built up out of the substance particles. Each conglomerate particle includes at least 8 substance particles in the desire realm. And that's earth, water, fire, air, form, smell, taste, and touch. So that, when Vasubandhu says that water is a conventional truth, he's not talking about the substance particle, elemental substance particle, water. He's talking about water as a mass of water. Okay. And then there's, all these different things. If a conglomerate particle is part of the body of a living being, then it has body sense faculty in addition, which is another substance particle. If it's part of I understand in your system you have involved in perception, you have the object of perception and you have the consciousness. And then those are the things we usually talk about. But you also have this sense faculty. You have special, subtle material within the body that makes it possible for us to see, and special, subtle material in the body that makes it possible for us to hear, and so forth. So that, if it's any part of the body of the sentient beings, then you have the body, sense, faculty, substance. If it's, in addition to being part of the sentient being, also part of the sensory material in the eye, ear, nose, or tongue, then you have another substance that makes 10. If sound is present, then you have a 11th substance particle. So you can get up to 11 if you have a noisy room with the body of a sentient being and you're talking about a substance particle that exists in the subtle material in the eye that sees forms, then you would have 11, assuming that person's in the desire realm. But in the form realm, the substance particles of odor and taste are absent, and thus, if you don't have any of the other things as well, you could get down to as few as 6. So generally there's 8, but depending on the circumstance, there can be anywhere between 6 and 11 of these substance particles in each one of these conglomerate particles. I'm sure you're highly edified by that.